Well, thank you. I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude to Angelo, Leon, and Madeline for organizing the conference, of which this is kind of a part, and Richard for exerting his vast power to make it possible for me to be here, and the staff. That was vast overpraise that you just heard. I've tried to offer a few kind of framework books about how one might think about where human rights came from, and as I'll say in a minute, this one's intended to be a corrective, not least to myself and my own prior way of thinking about the history of human rights. What I thought for today is that I would present some of the ideas in this recent book really in a fashion that I hope can be maximally relevant to the conference, of which many of you aren't a part, but some of us are. And I've decided to do so just informally for the sake of conversation amongst ourselves. So I'll try to give a few minutes of thinking about the relation of national welfare and international human rights, but save as much time as possible for conversation amongst ourselves. So I'll start by saying that there's very little consensus right now about how one should think about where human rights, and especially international human rights, came from. But in retrospect, after 10 years of debate on that topic, often intense debate, perhaps the most striking fact is that no one in the field of professional history of human rights has really connected the question of how we got interested in human rights, how they became so central, if not to the regulation of our world, at least to our aspirations for how it ought to be regulated, to distributive ethics and political economy. It's worth just observing at the start how absent that topic has been until recently. Most historians have taken the question about where human rights came from to be a question about the birth of the moral idea that individuals have non-negotiable entitlements against the state or society. And they've looked very distantly in the past, some way back in classical times, others in the Middle Ages. Certainly in early modern natural law traditions, it's only fair to acknowledge that, that there was such a commitment among certain philosophers. Others of us have emphasized in response to that way of thinking about it, that what we're looking for is not merely a moral idea, but one that fits within a series of political projects, starting most obviously with the project of political revolution. And so one of the privileged spots to look for the origins of human rights is precisely in the North Atlantic revolutions of the late 18th century. And yet when that was done, most notably in the really most famous book in this field, Lynn Hunt's Inventing Human Rights, the distributive and the economic were absent. In her fine book, it goes unmentioned that not only was the right to property central to these early modern revolutions, including in their fundamental texts like the Declaration of Independence of 1776 and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789. But she also fails to mention, really in much of the book, that there were also economic and social rights from very early on in this tradition. I'll just bypass the fact that one can find them even in these medieval traditions of moral philosophy when certain Christian thinkers defended the right to steal in cases of need, as an example. But as of 1793, when the Jacobin state propounded a new declaration of the rights of man and citizen, a declaration that Hunt doesn't mention either in her book, there were stated rights, entitlements of citizens to public relief and education. Meanwhile, we can acknowledge that in the next big moment of human rights history, when I would say the lion's share of scholarship has been done on this question where human rights came from in the 1940s, it's only fair to admit that there was more attention to economic and social rights since, after all, they were canonized as part of the famed Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. And yet, there wasn't much emphasis in the major works on this period either, like Marianne Glendon's A World Made New, on the political economic moment of the 1940s, what was going on in general in the history of political economy at that time. Finally, there's been an increasing amount of work, and mine has been associated with this in the purposes of full disclosure, with this allegedly transformative or pivotal moment of the 1970s. As you see, I'll show you a couple of so-called n-grams in this lecture, which basically allow you through Google's power to compute how frequently and with what prominence human beings use various names, words, and phrases. And this is an English language chart, but you see that something happened in the 1970s, and actually it happened in all languages that Google so far allows us to check, that led to this turning point in the prominence of human rights, of creating a wave that's crested, but on whose crest, of course, we still surf as citizens and idealists and scholars. And yet, in at least most of the accounts of that moment, including my own 10 years ago in The Last Utopia, precious little attention has been given to the distributive and the economic. Again, in fairness, I have to say that back 10 years ago, when I first tried to figure out what happened at that turning point in the 1970s, I did talk a fair bit about the death or collapse of socialism, or some ideologically important development in the history of socialist idealism, but I didn't pay much attention to what that meant kind of in terms of distributive ethics or political economy. And so this question emerges from this brief tour of the literature, at least as far as I know about it, how we might tell a story about where human rights have come from, how they've come to occupy, let's say, something close to the center of the reformist imagination that took seriously distributional ideals and the political economy that is the social form in which those ideals are vindicated or not. So I'm going to try again to tell the history of human rights. And I'm going to give, in this lecture, an account with 3 stages, very high altitude stylized account, and some of the conversation can be about what happens when we look closer to Earth and in more detail. First, there'll be roughly a 19th century phase of classical liberalism. Then there'll be a phase of the mid-century welfare state in the North Atlantic, and for some idealists as a global project. And then finally, there'll be, let's say, our own time since approximately the 1970s, which we can call, just as a shorthand time, a neoliberal time. And of course, one other thing we'll have to argue about is what that adjective might mean and what neoliberalism is and so forth and so on which I'll take a kind of cagey stance, as you'll see later. So starting out, I just want to introduce one distinction that comes to us from actually contemporary philosophy that I hope will provide some guidance in our odyssey over these 3 stages. And it's about the content of distributional obligation, whether framed in terms of rights or not. And the contrast is between so-called sufficiency and so-called equality. If you believe in sufficiency, you believe that someone may have the obligation to provide a floor of protection. And you're most concerned about where any individual might be located in relation to having nothing or not enough. Now we have to decide of what. One popular view today on left and right is that we should aggregate human goods or let people determine what they are on their own and monetize them and give them a universal basic income. Now, I'm not going to talk about that version of the proposal, but I'm going to suggest that many of those who have pursued social rights or economic and social rights have been committed to a rights-based version of sufficiency, namely the idea that there's a list of basic human goods and services to which everyone ought to have an entitlement, bringing them from having not enough of that good or service to having enough. And certainly it's true there's a subsistence margin. We might also argue that in certain contexts, the line of sufficiency is going to be more generous rather than less generous. But the point is that the moral claim is that there's a line of entitlement, and human rights might be about getting people to that line if they have a distributive component at all. Now, there are some people who argue that sufficient provision is our sole obligation to our fellow humans, and that position is known as sufficientarianism. And as I've tried to argue in my research, I hope this is true, the first person to explicitly endorse that view is Thomas Paine, when he said in 1796, "It doesn't matter how wealthy the wealthy are, so long as the poor are made less poor to whatever line of sufficient provision we've decided they get." A contemporary representative of that view is a Princeton philosopher, Harry Frankfurt. But then there's this other view in distributive ethics, which is the egalitarian view. And it says it doesn't or doesn't just matter that individuals have enough, but it matters what their relationship to one another is. And from that point of view, if you endorse it, it might well matter how rich the rich are. Even if it's the case that individuals have reached whatever their entitled line of provision is, you might argue it's important also, or separately, to live in a relatively equal society and bring the rich down, not just to suit the line of entitled sufficiency, but for its own sake. And that would be one version of an egalitarian claim. Now, I'll start with the 19th century because it seems as if human rights are generally about endorsing neither of those moral obligations, either sufficient provision or egalitarian distribution, in their dominant forms. Rights are associated, I'd say most through the 19th and early 20th century, with classical liberalism. And the core right that law defends and political movements try to institutionalize, and successfully, I might add, are the rights of freedom of contract and relatively sacrosanct property. It's in this environment, famously, that Karl Marx concluded that reformers had to ditch rights if they were going to overthrow the political economy of classical liberalism, which certainly endorsed growth, but didn't have any real interest in either sufficient provision or equal distribution. We could talk about Marxism in detail, but I'll just say in his famous youthful essay on the Jewish question, Marx endorsed a view that said that rights were inflexible their egoistic content and their service to the capitalist bourgeoisie, so-called, made them unsalvageable for reformers. And a big question in this project is whether those features, inflexibility and unsalvageability, that he identified in thinking about rights in the 19th century hold true later and for us. I'll just say in advance that while of course there were a number of rights movements in the 19th century, it's only proper, I think, historically to say that the most prominent and powerful were those movements for contract and property rights across the North Atlantic. That was the dominant use of the concept, including in law. And so Marx came by his beliefs about the inflexibility and unsalvageability of rights, let's say honestly. If we believe he was mistaken, he had grounds for his mistake given the distributive ethics of classical liberalism that he saw and the political economy with its results that he saw, which included, obviously, for the working class that he cared about, widespread misery in the context of galloping inequality. So that's the first stage. And I think it sets up this Marxist challenge for those of us who aren't sure about the inflexibility and unsalvageability of rights later, and in particularly in our time. Did rights prove flexible in ways that Marx couldn't anticipate? Are they salvageable for a politics that might be connected to these distributive ideals of sufficient provision and egalitarian distribution or not? So I'm going to generalize extremely roughly about what happens in the mid-20th century, the middle third especially. And it's significant for our conference because it seems as if we could describe the politics, including the political economy of the mid-20th century, and indeed I'll argue its implications for rights, as an attempt to see if, or what would be involved in overthrowing the picture that was established in the 19th century and on which Marx based his criticism. This classical liberal political economy had been global, at least incipiently. And of course, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx makes special emphasis of this point. He uses the concept of the cosmopolitan to refer to the project of capital in the 19th century. And not to be very original about it, what happens in the middle of the 20th century in the face of some of the misery and inequality that political economy produced alongside incredible growth was a series of national revolts. One of them was fascism. One of them, arguably, was the popularity of communism itself, which, of course, resolved in the end to sponsor a program of so-called socialism in one country. But generalizing across cases, including those that remain liberal, but grouping them with the fascist and communist alternatives of the middle of the 20th century, I think we could call these all projects of welfarism in one country. So that's why this talk is meant to connect with the conference, because there's a sense in which there's a victory of nationalism in response to classical liberal globalization. And the question is, in what form would it come? Now, I generalize across these various cases with obviously lots of dispute about, who came first, how influential the fascist version of this was, I think very influential, whether it's legitimate to call communist states both the Soviet Union before World War II and all the East European states after welfare states. I'm just going to, skip all of that to say what's going to matter to my account is that this second stage involves not just nationalization, but the attempt within those national spaces to embrace both of the ideals that I outlined before. Sufficient provision mattered, maybe not for the very worst off, but certainly for the working class, especially the white working class that was the privileged beneficiary of welfare states everywhere in the North Atlantic. But egalitarian distribution mattered too. That was true for Adolf Hitler, at least within the so-called Volksgemeinschaft. It was certainly true in the Soviet Union in between the wars and in communist states in the East after World War II. And indeed, it was critical to the liberal states, so-called, that emerged as social democratic or Christian democratic welfare states after World War II. We can note that this project was exclusionary in at least two very big senses. For one thing, they were national projects. That means they were devised for a national community. And that tracked the consensus about how these ideals of distribution would ever be institutionalized, precisely by choosing a favored group and insulating it against the classical liberal globalization that had led to the boom-bust cycle and to the misery and inequality that people found objectionable, for better or worse, in the middle of the 20th century. And that's why, famously, political economy in this period tends towards ideals of national self-sufficiency or even economic autarky. And the distributive ideals, insofar as they're institutionalized, are for the fellow citizens of that community, not for human beings in general. Obviously, there are also internal exclusions. So to the extent these national welfare projects favored co-nationals, they favored them selectively. They were directed towards, above all, the white male working class, always subordinating women. And insofar as there were racially stigmatized people in nations like mine, they were also often totally excluded from early welfare state provision. Now, the question is, what do rights have to do with any of this? So I want to claim that there are two big events for the history of rights in general in this moment, this second moment in the trajectory of distributive idealism and political economy in modern times. First, rights experience an extraordinary decrease in their salience for reform. I think this point is often missed, but it's critical to understanding the 1940s in particular, when lots of people, having waged war against the very concept of rights for 50 years, were very unsure that that concept could be salvaged for the sake of the new national welfare project. Already at the beginning of the 20th century, you see in the slide that war against the concept of rights had gone on so long and powerfully that even a relatively liberal commentator, John Hobson, could say there are very few takers for the idea that rights can be saved from Marx's withering verdict about their inflexibility and salvageability, even among liberals. And so it's maybe no wonder that in his 1944 Road to Serfdom, a neoliberal Friedrich Hayek embraces the concept of human rights on the grounds that there's still an open debate about whether this concept is really a classical liberal one that serves someone like him and can't be salvaged for the project of national welfare. Now, of course, there was another view. I'd say it wasn't as popular as the first view, but we have to acknowledge that it was real. And it was the view that percolated in the 19th century, but achieved, I think, greatest prominence starting in the interwar period and after World War II, that rights could be socialized. Many of us use the word social rights just to refer to part of the list of the Universal Declaration, but there's something more profound about that label, as many people in the 1940s understood, that it was an attempt to insist on the flexibility of human rights. The idea that rights weren't mortgaged to classical liberalism, but could be socialized to serve social purposes. I'm not going to go into this in any detail since time is passing, but let's just say that there's an intellectual campaign alongside the deconstruction of rights that was the main campaign of the first half of the 20th century to develop not just the various rights we call economic and social rights, but the very plausibility of the category of social rights. And I'll just mention in this connection the sociologist from France named Georges Gurvitch, who I believe was the first person to write a book about social rights. And he's very sensitive to this problem, even as he claims that that rights can be salvaged. They're flexible enough to do so. Now, what conclusions do we draw about the history of human rights from this double event for them in the middle of the 20th century? They lose their salience as reformist tools while also finding defenders who struggle to socialize them. Well, I think they're multiple. First, and I think, let's say, anti-Marxist, it's only fair to say that rights prove flexible in this period beyond what Marx anticipated, even though later in his own career, he himself championed what we would now call social rights, like the limitation of working hours. But it's also the case that they experienced that flexibility in, let's say, because there's this much bigger move from a classical liberal form of political economy to a national welfarist form of political economy. And it seems as if, based on these first two episodes at least, what rights are going to mean don't depend on themselves, but depend on the larger dominant form of political economy that's established in a certain place and time. So it's unsurprising in retrospect that rights were so indentured to classical liberalism, just as when classical liberalism was overthrown, rights could be updated and potentially serve different forces. I want to make one final point before we turn to the Universal Declaration proper, which is that it seems as if even when reformers embraced the flexibility of rights and tried to establish various lists of, doctrines of, and justifications for social rights, they were defending the norms of sufficient provision. That's what their arguments say about the role of social rights. That's what they seem to be about on paper. But it's very significant, I think, that we acknowledge that their arguments made sense across the Atlantic in this moment of political economy where there was both egalitarianism and nationalism in establishing both the scope of distributional ideals and their content and the political economic forms in which they were institutionalized, if at all. Of course, thanks to Thomas Piketty's famous research, we now say, at least to the satisfaction of economists more so than we did before, that there was this moment in the middle of the 20th century coinciding with these events when national inequality was constrained compared to the era before or since. And so my claim is that we should make sense of the flexibility of rights in this moment of social rights, but also not forget to connect that project to both the national form and the egalitarian consequences of the welfare state in its time. We could talk about how that occurred. Depending on where we look across the Atlantic space, different people frame the relation of sufficient provision to equal distribution differently. Let's say broadly that the further east one went, the more direct embrace of egalitarian distribution one found within limits. Even Joseph Stalin says there are limits to the material equality communism brings about, and worried about those who were demanding too much. In a very interesting case in the United Kingdom, the intellectual who probably said the things about social rights that I think remain most canonical from this 1940s moment, T.H. Marshall, interestingly, believed that social rights were unintelligible separate from an egalitarian project, and of course a national one, because he was writing in his classic essay merely about the British welfare state and indeed not mentioning its imperial holdings. And yet his optimism for that national community in retrospect is striking. The idea was that the flexibility of rights was such that socializing them and providing a sufficient minimum could not be disentangled from an egalitarian project. If you like, he thinks that social rights are inflexible, that if you establish them, to the extent you establish them, you're automatically part of an egalitarian project. In my earlier metaphor, which is of course his, to begin with, to the extent you establish a floor of protection, you automatically build a ceiling on inequality. So I'll just mention that in passing because I think it's relevant later. So just again in passing, I think these considerations force me at least to rethink what the Universal Declaration was. In the old human rights history, including my own, the Universal Declaration is treated as a post-Holocaust moral breakthrough to establish supra-sovereign protection of human beings. And many celebrated it for those ends. Other people were cynical about it, like me, because it seems that, like, the truth is that it failed, and its partisans failed to establish that breakthrough at the time, raising the question when that project did become more plausible. But I think that both sides of that debate, in retrospect, were wrong, because it assumed that the main vocation of the UDHR was to internationalize protection. And I think, leaving aside a few of its framers, for the few who heard about the Universal Declaration in its own time, the goals would have been understood very differently, to be consistent with national welfarism. And so rather than seeing the UDHR as, let's say, a premature attempt to internationalize rights, I think it's much better to see it as a template for the national welfarist project. Now, that, among other reasons, explain why economic and social rights were so uncontroversially part of the Universal Declaration. Very few objections to their inclusion. And it also, I think, leads us to think about the relative position of non-discrimination and social rights in the document. Most of us might have said that economic and social rights were the most controversial thing about the UDHR. But it might be that what was most controversial was its commitment to non-discrimination amongst kinds of citizens across all norms. And of course, we get very little traction in national settings for that anti-discrimination law until decades later, whereas the welfare state in its glory years, is actually trying across the North Atlantic to vindicate many of the norms of sufficient provision. And so my suggestion is that we reread the UDHR in the light of the story I've been trying to tell. For one thing, the fact that the main reformist project was to marginalize the plausibility of rights as a reformist language helps us account for why so few people seem to know or care about the document at the time it was crafted. More important, to the extent they did know about it, it was because it took the second track, socializing rights like a number of constitutions before it and at the time it was founded, and not establishing rights of non-citizens, but rights of sufficient provision within a series of modular national projects. It was only much later that you get treaty law and, above all, transnational international human rights activism, including with respect to social rights, which in its prominence was reserved for even later. So I need to speed up. I'll just mention that at stake in the book that I've written is what happens to the welfare state after its North Atlantic founding. And briefly, it's globalized by post-colonial states in two senses. First, the modular reproduction of the welfare state is taken to the ends of the earth. That's the goal of decolonization, essentially. And when we look at the rhetoric of post-colonial leaders, it's not just formal sovereignty, but a welfare state for each people. And indeed, to the extent that they talk about the distributive goals of the welfare states they will found, the post-colonial leaders favor the egalitarian component of welfare states even more than their North Atlantic avatars had. More important, the post-colonial states invent global justice. I don't think socialists, even prior to their era of nationalization after World War I, had really done so, in spite of their famed 19th century internationalism. The post-colonial states really found our notion that there's potentially a global distributive space in which the ideals of sufficiency and equality might be at stake. And indeed, they take steps over the 20 decolonizing years to see if they can not just reproduce the welfare states as a modular matter, but scale it up to be a global phenomenon, or what some in this era refer to as a welfare state. And once again, if you look at their heyday, just as they'd talked about sufficiency less and equality more at home, when they get to the global stage, they talk about sufficient provision almost not at all, as if various national states would take care of that problem. And what they wanted to institutionalize in terms of global governance was global egalitarianism. But of course, that didn't come to pass. And instead, we get the neoliberal period. Now, in this phase in my story, I'm going to be in respectful dialogue with the very powerful Marxist view, which, as in the classical liberal period, is going to say in response to our era of distributional idealism and political economy, that the key to thinking about human rights law and movements in our time is the victory of neoliberalism. That's what Susan Marx has influentially argued, really one of the best Marxist international lawyers of our time, insists that, contrary to all the literature on human rights until recently, we can't tell its history without talking about the political economy, so-called neoliberal of our present. And then indeed, it's the key to that history. So I want to engage with this view, mainly starting with the flexibility and salvageability of rights politics that I believe my account of the national welfarist era has already suggested needs to be kept in mind. So I want to set a few, let's say, ground rules or lay out a few premises for thinking about this problem, mainly to insist on how different the so-called neoliberal period of human rights has been from both the classical liberal and national welfarist phases beforehand. Just a laundry list of ways in which it seems like we're dealing with something interestingly distinctive. So for one thing, Hayek lost the rhetorical battle. In 1944, he could still say that his project of economic freedom against the welfare state, and especially its plan form, could make use of, indeed rally under the banner of human rights. By the 70s, he'd changed his mind because human rights, since then and in our time, have been an identifiably reformist language. They've not reverted to be largely, or even, partly, a language that revolves around freedom of contract and sanctity of private property. Of course, those forces that support those things can use rights. But some things happen in our time that didn't exist in the 19th century, which was a viable reformist language of human rights that we associate with things like the United Nations and its various projects, non-governmental organizations and their various projects. And then the question is, what are those projects? So the other thing we might observe about the neoliberal period of human rights is that in contrast to national welfarist political economy, they focused heavily on what one might call status equality, in contradistinction to material equality or distributive equality generally. The idea of status equality is basically, anti-discrimination law's premise that no one should be treated differently because the kind of person they are, be on grounds of gender or race or sexual orientation or indigeneity. And it seems important to observe that actually in the 19th century, but certainly today, rights have become very strongly associated with the pursuit of status equality, both in national settings and as a global movement in its various forms. This seems like it's very different than the uses, albeit marginal, that national welfarist advocates made of human rights. As I said, there wasn't much emphasis on gender and racial equality in the glory years of the welfare state. Some people think that project was premised on its exclusions internally, not just externally. Whereas we believe, most of us, that human rights aren't worth having if they're shot through with those kinds of exclusions on the basis of gender, race, and the rest. Finally, human rights, albeit belatedly, especially in global northern NGOs, have devoted themselves with more and more vigor to economic and social rights of sufficient provision. We can tell a story, and I would, according to which human rights, when they were rediscovered by cause groups like Amnesty International and so forth in the 70s, just forgot about the second half of the list of the Universal Declaration, even though it had not only been there, but was utterly central to the national welfarist interpretation of human rights. But if we want to make that claim, which we have to unceasingly, we also have to acknowledge that due to their own thinking and due to global Southern pressure on the end of the Cold War, economic and social rights have become rather central to human rights activism as we know it, and of course, human rights monitoring under various treaties and in various fora, and thanks to various special rapporteurs and so on and so forth. So in contrast to the Marxist view of how we make sense of the relation of human rights to so-called neoliberalism, just heading towards my conclusions, I want to establish an ecological view. Human rights prove flexible once again in this new age of political economy. And so what really matters is what the emphases of that new political economy have been. in contradistinction to the prior two ages. And one of the main point I want to make is that even as they became more cosmopolitan, both within national settings and as a global affair, human rights lost their previous ecological relationship to materially egalitarian concern in general at all levels of analysis. And that's going to help us understand, I think, how human rights have, if not made peace, because they haven't with neoliberal dynamics, then at least fit in the age of neoliberalism. You might put it this way. As a weak entity redefined by the ambient political economy, it's not that human rights projects have been threatening to the political economy of our age, because actually they demand huge alterations within it. But it's mainly alterations at the level of the floor of sufficient provision. They're about demanding that everyone get enough of the good things in life, whether in their nations when there are austerity policies, or as a global affair, since the dynamics of the 1960s and 70s led to the discovery of global poverty as our era's hallmark moral problem. And of course, that problem is generally addressed outside the ambit of human rights talk, but human rights do provide a language for addressing the basic distributive entitlements of humanity. And yet, human rights have tended in almost all of their articulations, and especially in their dominant articulations, to provide no opposition to the obliteration of ceilings on inequality that have increasingly been destroyed in national settings in the neoliberal era. There had been other projects, socialism nationally and the NIEO globally, that had directly insisted on ceilings on distributional inequality, but those are, let's say, gone for better or worse. Human rights has distributive commitments, but it's no longer in the national welfarist ecology where equality is provided for citizens or some modicum of it. Rather, we have cosmopolitan responsibilities within and without to provide status equality without material equality, and sufficient provision without material equality. So this view is just ever so different from a more Marxian view, which says we should kind of place some blame on human rights ideas and movements, either for causing neoliberalism or distracting us from its victory. I don't think human rights was an important enough project to deserve any blame. Neoliberalism succeeded on, if we develop a list of causal elements in its victory, human rights is not going to be on the list or so far down as to make it not worth talking about. I think the bigger and more identifiable problem is that in the absence of egalitarian politics, it either in a first phase didn't talk about distribution at all, or in our time focuses on that floor of provision. We'd have to vindicate this argument. The period since the 1973 Chilean coup and the first neoliberal experiment and our time is vast, decades, and it covers the world. And we'd have to see which of these accounts is plausible in different places, and I won't do that because I can't, and I've tried to the extent I can in the book. I'll just conclude by saying that in a way the argument is that we're living in Marshall's nightmare. Remember that he claimed that that social rights were inflexible. They could not but fit as part of an egalitarian project. And it seems as if he was wrong. To the extent they figure in our idealism, they seem to figure in the absence of or as an alternative to egalitarian politics, whether in national settings or globally. Put differently, we actually have built lots of floors, though they're spotty and imperfect and inadequate, and we can argue about how high they ought to be. But it's in the very era of the increase in national equality, almost in every state. The marquee case would, of course, be China, where not to rally behind it as a great human rights state, certainly not in terms of political and civil rights or even economic and social runs, but in terms of extreme poverty, so-called, it has been heroic in its marketized and so-called neoliberal phase in the midst of, the greatest increase in national inequality perhaps ever, even relative to my own country, which, has gotten so much worse. So this is like the opposite of what Marshall expected, and the Chinese relationship is one that's reproduced in most countries, just less graphically. So, I'll conclude by saying I want to establish a view across this new history of human rights that insists on the flexibility of human rights, including making room for the invention of social rights, while also conceding that Marx was on to something in suggesting that ultimately the dominant form of political economy is going to have a huge influence on everything else that's going on in whatever place and time that politics is going on. But the flexibility of human rights means that should we band together to form a post-neoliberal political economy, we can take rights with us. We can not only insist on all the wonderful things that human rights laws and lawyers and movements and institutions have been doing. We can correct them, making sure they take their own norms of sufficient provision more seriously than they have. We can also insist that they be part of a new ecology that is egalitarian rather than inegalitarian, as has been the case so far. I want to flirt with the idea that we need to get very worried about the fact that even to the extent we defend their flexibility, human rights as we know them have prospered on the grave of socialism, whether as a national project or if you want to think about the NIEO in socialist terms as a global one. This engram is my favorite I've ever made, just because it doesn't prove anything except confirms my beliefs that I had before running the engram. So that's the danger of these tools. But just note that the high point of socialism in our language and in every language Google allows for testing is in 1975 through 7. And then it begins to crater precisely at the time that human rights begins its storied career in our language and perhaps in our ideals. The lines cross in 1989, and neither trend has continued abated. It might not matter if human rights were just another set of words for socialism, but I've argued it's not, because it's succeeded only on condition of the loss of egalitarianism that eventually, not in its origins, was one of socialism's most obvious commitments. So I'm done. I will just conclude by saying none of these remarks were intended to be critical of the current form of human rights, especially in the face of, threats to them today, new threats, old threats, whatever threats you see. But we should also supplement them and make sure, if we believe in distributive equality and not mere sufficiency, that we simultaneously struggle for a new ecology for human rights. Now, I strongly believe that if you're concerned about populism, so-called, this is your agenda. Because the people in revolt, seemingly, at least in some of the places of so-called populism, are precisely the old favored beneficiaries of national welfarism. And human rights, whether nationally or internationally, I think we must concede depend on conditions they can't guarantee. And if majorities do not want them, in the end, even if you hold out for your heroic experts or your saving judges, they will not survive majority wrath. So I would argue for a form of human rights that is a rethought as a project that clearly serves majorities in ways that make sense to them. And I would claim that part of this need to insert human rights in an egalitarian ecology once again, without giving up on status equality, without giving up on global justice, is to find ways of bringing sufficient provision and material equality as ideals that make sense to more people as a political project that deserves our support. Thank you very much.